Good day, sir. Good day, classmates. Our topic is all about the American occupation of the Philippines. First, that we will be talking about is the Treaty of Paris of 1898. So, before the 19th century, Spain had once been the most powerful naval in the Atlantic. This had changed by the end of 19th century. The US Navy, with superior ships and better weapons, destroyed two of the most important fleets of Spain. American land forces also defeated Spanish forces in Cuba as well as Philippines. In Puerto Rico, a number of battles were fought between the two sides. Ultimately, Spain lost control of all three of its colonies and finally agreed to negotiate for peace. This finally led to the Treaty of Paris. So, this treaty signed by Spain and United States on December 10, 1898 that ended the Spanish-American War. So, the Spain relinquished all claim of Cuba to the United States, and Puerto Rico and Guam were also ceded by Spain to the United States, and $20 million is the payment of US to Spain in exchange of the Philippines. So, paano nga ba sinakop ng United States ang Guam, Puerto Rico at ang Pilipinas? So, the McKinley administration issued orders to capture Guam on the way to Manila Bay. Spanish authorities surrendered the island, allowing the US to claim it in the Treaty of Paris. Next is Samson bombarded Spanish fortifications in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and General Nelson A. Miles and 3,300 U.S. soldiers landed at Guanica and took over the island. And just like what happened to Guam, Puerto Rico was formally transferred to the U.S. in the Treaty of Paris. The McKinley administration demanded full control over the archipelago of 7,100 islands of the Philippines, and President McKinley instructed U.S. negotiators in Paris to insist upon the cession of the whole of the Philippines, thus denying Filipinos the right to independent government. So the War of 1898 offered a unique opportunity for America's empire builders to acquire overseas territories. The United States enabled to extend their power and expand their territories and acquiring positions to Guam and Puerto Rico. In the Treaty of Paris, the United States obtained full sovereignty over the archipelago and its 8 million inhabitants, to the bitter disappointment of the Filipino freedom fighters. Because of the signed treaty, there was a debate happened between imperialists and anti-imperialists. American claims on Spanish territory still had to be validated, as two-thirds approval of the Senate was required for the ratification of the Treaty of Paris. So the imperialists held to the assumed rights of conquest, while the anti-imperialists held to the idea that the Philippines as well as Cuba should have their independence. The debate proved frustrating to anti-imperialists, as President McKinley refused to acknowledge that the U.S. was engaged in imperialism or that his administration harbored any imperial intentions. So the first meeting of what would become the National Anti-Imperialist League took place in Boston on June 15, 1898, 3 days after Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence. The leaders of the group were among the most prominent and educated New Englanders, including four university presidents and a dozen leading scholars. So George S. Bothwell was the first president of the American Anti-Imperialist League. So the anti-imperialists organized formed chapters in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, and other cities. And they arranged speaking events and distributed leaflets, issued press releases, recruited members, and initiated a mass petition campaign against extending the U.S. power over the Philippines. Address to the people of the United States. This is the founding document of the Anti-Imperialist League that was published on November 19, 1898. That laid to three major arguments in opposition to imperialism. So the first argument is that the United States is founded on the principle that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed, and that this principle must be applied in foreign affairs as well as in domestic institutions. Second is the U.S. Constitution contains no provisions for holding colonies and creating a subject class of citizens. And lastly, those who fought the heroic struggles for liberty of the people in the Spanish islands should not be deprived of independence and rights. So the issue of imperialism was not just about foreign policy. It was about national identity and the very character of the nation. For some anti-imperialists, notably Samuel Gompers and Senator Pitchfork Bean Tillman of South Carolina, opposition of the annexation of the Philippines was based on racial exclusion. So the Anti-Imperialist League as a whole, however, took a more principled stance, insisting that all men of whatever race or color are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. William Jennings Bryan is a former House member from Nebraska and Democratic Party presidential aspirant, and declared himself an anti-imperialist but decided to support the treaty. He is arguing that the rejection of the treaty would leave the US at war with Spain, and that another treaty granting Filipino independence could be enacted later. But most of the Democrats rejected these contentions, as there was no possibility of renewed warfare with Spain, and many thought it better to amend the treaty than to give the imperialists a free hand under it. Advocates of Annexation of the Philippines, that was written by Jim Zwick. And those who are advocates of the annexation of the Philippines are calling themselves as expansionists, not imperialists, and they insult their opponents for being satisfied with Little America while they are seeking for a greater America. So the proponents of imperialism they have advanced several arguments in favor of the ratification of the Treaty of Paris. They claim that the Philippines would serve U.S. economic interests by securing access to the East Asian market. Trade obtained from the Philippines and especially China would benefit the American economy. The Presbyterian Interior declared that the churches will stand solidly against abandoning the islands. But then the Catholic hierarchy was initially worried but soon came around to supporting U.S. position of the Philippines after the McKinley administration promised to protect the lives of priests and the property of the church. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge is an imperialist, and he warned that failure to ratify the treaty would damage the United States' standing as a great power, and he stressed that the Philippines were to gain its independence, the islands would be quickly swallowed by another conniving imperialist power. And he also said that the Philippines would descend into anarchy and chaos without a civilized power administrating it. Thus, in large view, U.S. policy was an act of magnanimity or kagandahang loob. So Senator Albert Beveridge is a leading voice for the imperialists, and he stated that the rule of liberty was only for people who were capable of self-government, which did not include the Filipinos. One New Yorker wrote to the elderly Senator Hoar in February 1899, and it said that what this country needs most of this time are patriotic Americans, not a lot of old women and these decrepit politicians in their dotage who pose as statesmen. You are behind the times. The nation has outgrown you. Give yourself a rest in some old man's home and give the nation a chance to grow. And there is an historian named Walter Hickson argued that this form of militant discourse reinforced traditional depictions of women as weak and forced men to live up an equal stereotype conception of men as strong and dominant. So because of these arguments, the anti-imperialist senators attempted to expose the hypocrisy behind their opponents' arguments, which are the imperialists. And essentially, they declared that the civilizing mission is fraud, that the expansionists or the imperialists were not interested in saving souls but in extending the power and influence of the United States. So the anti-imperialists accurately predicted the future. Their auguries were beyond the horizon of the most Americans. So the anti-imperialists brought former President Grover Cleveland to lobby Congress against the ratification of the treaty, and Andrew Carnegie offered to give Filipino people $20 million so that they could buy their independence. But in the end, however, it was not enough. So on February 4, 1899, with the Senate still deadlocked, fighting broke out in the Philippines between U.S. and Filipino soldiers. Aguinaldo immediately called for a suspension of hostilities, but the American commander in the Philippines, General Elwell S. Otis, was intent on war. And the general had been making preparations for the fight, and once the first shot was fired, directed his forces to annihilate the Filipino troops. And Senator Hoar introduced a resolution declaring that the people of the Philippine Islands of right oath to be free and independent, and that it is their right to institute a new government for themselves. And on February 6, 1899, the Senate voted 59 to 29 to ratify the treaty, passing the two-thirds threshold by a bare one-vote margin. The United States thus became a formal imperial power 123 years after its rebellion against British imperial rule in 1776. Hostilities had begun at Manila between U.S. troops and insurgents led by Emilio Aguinaldo.
Benevolent assimilation, the American conquest of the Philippines. Bago ang lahat, may ideya ba kayo ukol dito? Dahil kung wala, sakto, ngayon, malalaman niyo na kung ano nga ba ito. Ano nga ba ang benevolent assimilation? Benevolent assimilation, the assimilation of a group of people by observing foreign people into a new culture, with the primary stated reason being that it is an act of benevolence. It is like an imperialism wherein a powerful country takes over a weaker country. Its motivation includes economic gain, increased power in military, nationalism expansion, spreading of religious and racial ideologies. So, assimilation means a policy making a country as a province of another country. Paano nga ba ito nagsimula? It was started because of the War of Spain and the United States noong April 21, 1898. Ito ang pinakauna-unahang pakikipaglaban ng United States sa ibang bansa. Noong May 1, 1898, natalo ng US Navy ang Espanya sa Pilipinas sa pamumuno ni Commodore George Dewey. At ang digmaang ito ay mas kilala sa tinatawag na Battle of Manila Bay. Ang digmaang ito ay nagresulta sa pagsuko ng Espanya sa Estados Unidos at dahil dito, napilitan ng Espanya na ibenta ang Pilipinas sa Estados Unidos sa halagang 20 milyon na nangyari sa Treaty of Paris. President Emilio Aguinaldo was a Filipino revolutionary politician and military leader who is officially recognized as the first and the youngest president of the Philippines. Noong June 12, 1898, si President Emilio Aguinaldo declared the Philippines independence and established a revolutionary government was the Filipino Revolutionary Armed Forces surrounded Manila and occupying American Army. President William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States. Sino nga ba si President William McKinley? Well, siya ang gumawa ng proklamasyon at ginawa niya ito noong December 21, 1898. President McKinley issued the Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation and announced in the Philippines on January 4, 1899. The President gave his Benevolent Assimilation speech which claimed U.S. sovereignty over the islands. He declared that it is the paramount aim of the military administration to win the confidence, respect, and the affection of the inhabitants of the Philippines by assuring them in every possible way that full measure of individual rights and liberties, which is the heritage of free peoples, and by proving to them that the mission of the United States is one of benevolent assimilation, substituting the mild way of justice and right for arbitrary rule. Nakapaloob sa proklamasyong ito ng pagpapahayag ni President William McKinley na manatili ang Estados Unidos sa Pilipinas upang pamahalaan ito. Ang pangunahing layunin nito ay sakop ang Pilipinas sa pamamagitan ng pagkikipagsundo upang makuha ang loob at tiwala ng mga Pilipino. Nilinaw rin ni Pangulong William McKinley at ang mga Amerikano na ginagawa nila ito upang hindi manakop, manlupig at sakupin ang bansang Pilipinas, kundi dahil upang makipagkaibigan, protektahan ang mga katutubo sa kani-kanilang pagninirahan, sa kani-kanilang trabaho, sa kani-kanilang pansarili at panglihirayong karapatan. L.S. Otis was a United States Army general who served in the American Civil War, Indian Wars, the Philippines late in the Spanish-American War, and during the Philippine-American War. Si General Otis ang Gobernador General ng Estados Unidos na nagdala ng proklamasyon sa Pilipinas sa ilalim ng pag-uutos ng Presidente ng Estados Unidos na si Presidente William McKinley. When President McKinley issued the Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation, which outlined his colonizing policies in the Philippines, in response, on January 1, 1899, the Philippine Republic was declared Emilio Aguinaldo as its president, but the United States refused to recognize it as the legitimate government. In reaction to this non-recognition, the Filipino government proclaimed its constitution on January 27, 1899. On February 4, 1899, the Philippine Republic had declared war on the United States after 3 Filipino soldiers were killed by U.S. troops. The fighting eventually came to be known by a variety of names: the Philippine Insurrection, the Philippine-American War, the Filipino-American War, the Philippine War, and the Philippine Revolution, which will be tackled later on. Sa kabuuan, ang Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation is a piece of paper declaring that America will benefit the Philippines. In this proclamation, the Filipinos found out that it is not true that the United States only want to help the country. Filipino found out that Americans who advocated annexation evinced a variety of motivation. First, religion, na kung saan nais ng mga Pilipino na mas mahubog ang Filipino upang naging isang Kristiyano. Pangalawa, economic, na nakita nila ang kasaganaan ng iba't ibang panbalasa o spices sa bansa na kung saan nakatawag sa pansin nila. Pangatlo, defense, kung saan gawing pangdepensa ang Pilipinas kapag nagkaroon ng digmaan.
The Philippine-American War 1899 to 1902. So on May 1, Commodore George Dewey's naval squadron annihilated the aging Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. A small contingent of U.S. troops arrived 1 month later, followed by a large contingent under General Thomas M. Anderson on June 30. So Emilio Aguinaldo, the 29-year-old son of a municipal governor and leader of Philippine rebellion against Spain, was of the impression that the Americans had come to help the Filipino insurgents secure their independence. The Filipino forces, he told his troops, were now allied with the great North American nation, the cradle of liberty, and therefore the friend to our people. Over the course of the summer, however, several developments caused Aguinaldo and his generals to distrust American intentions. So there was no Taylor Amendment for the Philippines. The McKinley administration dropped all pretense of endorsing independence and demanded full control over the archipelago. In the aftermath of the defeat of the Spanish, President McKinley moved to solidify U.S. authority over the Philippines and expand the U.S. military occupation. So General Elwell Otis is a United States Army general who pressured Aguinaldo to relocate his forces on the outskirts of Manila, then barred Filipino troops from entering the capital. Admiral George Dewey is a U.S. naval commander who defeated the Spanish fleet at the Battle of Manila Bay during the Spanish-American War, and he ordered the Filipino vessels in Manila Bay to take down their Philippine flags. The symbolism was clear: only the American flag would be flown over the Philippines. Dewey also denied that he had made any promises to Emilio Aguinaldo regarding to national independence. The McKinley administration had already rejected Aguinaldo's original declaration of independence, and he ignored this announcement as well. It is quite possible that war could have been avoided if McKinley been willing to grant the Philippines a protectorate status. And by mid-January 1899, Aguinaldo was prepared to accept an agreement similar to the one signed with Cuba. He would consider settling for a limited independence, in spite of the objections from several of his other advisors. During the last 3 weeks of peace, Otis initiated a series of orders and maneuvers indicating that he may have planned and provoked the war. The beginning of war. On February 2, Otis placed his troops on full alert and notified Admiral Dewey that the war could begin at any moment. Finally, on February 4, he ordered his sentries to fire at any Filipinos entering American-occupied territory. That evening, 2 American privates shot 4 Filipino soldiers, and now that believed to have been drunk and unarmed. In the morning, U.S. troops and artillery units launched a full-scale attack on Filipino positions, resulting in the death of approximately 3,000 Filipino soldiers as compared to 60 Americans. The 1st Idaho and 1st Washington Volunteers massacred hundreds of Filipinos who tried to cross the Pasig River. An American officer estimated that about 700 Filipinos who attempted to cross in boats and by swimming were killed, drowned, wounded, or captured. Meanwhile, Admiral George Dewey's naval guns indiscriminately pounded the coastlines. U.S. officials in Washington validated Otis' decision and continued to pursue the war. They labeled it an insurrection. Portraying the conflict in this manner served to delegitimize Filipino aspirations for independence and portray the Filipinos as childish, rebellious, and ungrateful. Winning Filipino hearts and minds. The latter was more in keeping with the idea of benevolent assimilation. It included building roads, improving sanitation, appointing Filipinos to local government councils, and tutoring Filipinos in the art of self-government, although under American rule. For many U.S. officials, however, tutoring Filipino in the art of self-government was a doubtful proposition. William Howard Taft is a Governor General of the Philippines, and he reported that our little brown brothers would need approximately 50 or 100 years of close supervision to develop anything resembling Anglo-Saxon political principles and skills. Like McKinley, he ignored the fact that Aguinaldo had created a republic prior to the outbreak of war and denied that such capabilities for self-government already existed among his little brothers. Ilustrados, or also known as the wealthy Filipinos, are not just the only one who collaborated with the United States. The U.S. Army also recruited soldiers among the Filipinos, especially Macabebes. So the Macabebes served as scouts and joined paramilitary and police forces established after 1901. This group had previously served under the Spanish and despised the Tagalogs, which dominated the insurgent ranks. American officers found them so helpful they created an additional 4 companies and eventually had over 10,000 serving as servants to the U.S. troops. Suppressing Filipino independence. The majority of generals who served in the Philippines had participated in the various conflicts with American Indians in the late 19th century. Out in the field, the goal was not to win hearts and minds, but to terrorize the population into submission, creating a climate of fear that would undermine popular support for Aguinaldo. Between February and late October 1899, Aguinaldo fought U.S. troops conventionally and suffered numerous defeats. Fighting between the two sides largely occurred on the island of Luzon, including the capital Manila and the towns of Malolos and Tarlac. U.S. artillery pounded Filipino lines, disseminating their forces, armed with inferior weapons and lacking ammunition. Aguinaldo realized that continuing with the same strategy would lead to certain defeat. Hence, U.S. soldiers on the front lines rarely acknowledged any positive views of Filipinos in their diaries or letters home. Instead, they displayed paternalistic and racist feelings towards the Filipinos. Moreover, it seemed that the longer they remained in the Philippines, the greater their contempt for the Filipinos. As African American soldiers were determined to prove their own worth, many viewed the Filipinos sympathetically as people struggling for their own freedom. Sergeant Patrick Mason confessed, "I feel sorry for these people and all that have come under control of the U.S. I don't believe they will be justly dealt by. The first thing in the morning is nigger, and the last thing at night is nigger." Reverend W.A. Holmes characterized the conflict as an effort by white America to inflict on the inhabitants of the Philippines color phobia, Jim Crow cars, disenfranchisement, lynchers, and everything that prejudice can do to blight the manhood of the dark races. African American editors were also divided. Newspapers such as the Indianapolis Recorder. In this, Filipinos viewed as colored cousins who, like black Americans, struggled for emancipation and suffered under the same odious racism. Captain John Leland Jordan similarly complained the Filipinos cannot even be said to be half civilized but must be classed as barbaros. On July 4, 1902, less than 1 week after the Senate hearing adjourned, President Roosevelt officially declared victory in the Philippines. The war, in fact, was not over, as fighting in the southern provinces continued until 1914. While the anti-imperialists did not defeat the Treaty of Paris or end the U.S.-Philippine War, they provided a valuable service to the nation. Michael Hunt, diplomatic historian, wrote, Far from being blank slates on which Americans were to write, Asians had their own dreams, and their dogged attachment to those dreams helped disabuse Americans of the idea of a cheap or easy Asian imperium. So, it took the United States approximately 3.5 years to crush the resistance in the greater part of the Philippines. The ensuing Philippine-American War lasted 3 years and resulted in the death of over 4,200 American and over 20,000 Filipino combatants. As many as 200,000 Filipino civilians died from violence, famine, and disease. The U.S. war in the Philippines continued for 3.5 years before President Theodore Roosevelt declared it over in July 4, 1902. The U.S. finally granted independence to the Philippines in 1946. Thank you for listening.